Nice, that was great, John, thank you. So, good evening everyone and welcome. I'm Troy Welly, the president of the Columbia Land Conservancy, so thank you all for coming. So on behalf of the Columbia Land Conservancy, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, friends, neighbors, partners, supporters, coming together around a shared commitment to the landscapes, wildlife, and communities that make Columbia County a special place to call home. This is my 5th anniversary with CLC, so Columbia County has been my home for that time. So happy to be here. For nearly 40 years, Columbia Land Conservancy has made a promise to you and future generations to care for the land that we all love. We've worked hard and hand in hand with landowners, farmers, local leaders to conserve the fields, forests, and working lands that define our region. Our mission is rooted in connection to the land, connection to one another, to the future we want to create together. Tonight's gathering is a chance to deepen those connections, an opportunity to explore the choices we make in our own backyards and how that can ripple outward into meaningful change. This evening is the start of something that I hope will last for years to come. And then in the weeks and months ahead, CLC is going to reach back out to you and ask, what promises are you making to the land based on what you hear tonight? I hope you'll be in touch with CLC, not only where we can help you achieve your goals, but you also hold us accountable to our own. So speaking of bringing people together, it's like, wow, the amazing number of what I'm going to call Tallamaniacs that have turned out tonight. I know many of you as CLC volunteers. I've seen you out on the trails, attendees of the Taconic Talk series, birders, and then of course many of the CLC supporters that I see in the room tonight. So thank you to all the supporters that are out there. We are honored to welcome Doug Tallamy tonight, our keynote speaker. Dr. Tallamy is a national renowned entomologist, ecologist, and author whose work has inspired thousands to rethink landscapes around them. He's created a movement that's become the homegrown national park. Through books like Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, he has shown us that every garden, every hedgerow, every yard can become part of a collective conservation effort that supports biodiversity and strengthens the ecological fabric that we depend on. His message is one of hope, empowerment, action, reminding us that conservation doesn't only happen within preserves, it begins at your doorsteps. We're also delighted to have Margaret Roach this evening. Margaret is a beloved writer, gardener, and voice for ecological stewardship, whose work has long connected people to the joys and responsibilities of cultivating a more thoughtful relationship with the natural world. Her work regularly appears in the New York Times, and like many of you, she's a Columbia County resident. She's going to introduce Doug tonight. Following Doug's talk, we're going to have a question and answer session. That is going to be led by Avalon Bungie. Avalon is one of the leaders of Pollinate HV and Partners for Climate Action. During the talk, I invite you to write down any questions that you have. You were given note cards in the beginning. So write down your questions, and if you need note cards, there's CLC staff. We can provide note cards to you. If you have a question that you want to have asked, raise your hand with the card, and staff will see that. Once they acknowledge you, hand it down to the aisle, and we'll collect those and ask those at the end. So thank you again for being here, for supporting the Columbia Land Conservancy, and for joining us in imagining and building a more resilient future for people and nature. So please join me in welcoming Margaret Roach.
Thank you, and Troy, and thank you. As a resident of the county, I want to say a personal thank you for the transformational work that CLC performs for us here. So thank you for that. Before introducing Doug, Troy asked me to talk for a couple of minutes about the importance of native plants. And that made me think back to how the light bulb went off for me gradually about the role they play. And so in case there's any doubt, I'm definitely not a trained scientist. In fact, I don't even have a college degree. But I'm someone who learns by doing and by witnessing. And in my case, the doing and witnessing was trying to learn how to garden. And as I've often said and written, birds taught me to garden. Because when I bought my place nearby almost 40 years ago, I'd see all these creatures flying around that were unfamiliar to a New York City girl. And I learned to ID the indigo bunting and the scarlet tanager and the brown creeper and all manner of woodpeckers and and then read whatever I could find out about each of their life histories, with the lofty and frankly selfish goal of making more and more and more of them feel welcome. It was maybe a decade before the debut of Google searches, so my early lessons came from books, from the start of what's now an embarrassingly giant collection of field guides and other natural history reference books. And a lot of what I learned in their pages that would prove germane to making a garden was about what the different birds ate. So what do birds eat? Most songbirds, for example, eat insects as at least part of their diet. Even birds that are vegetarians as adults generally feed some insects to their young, and many species, as we know, migrate southward in autumn, like we're witnessing now when insects are on the wane in the breeding grounds. They go where the insects are going to be able to be had in winter. So, surprise, even hummingbirds eat some insects. Anyway, early on I got the basic idea my bird gardening mission would actually be to grow bugs. But how? There were no instructions in the how-to gardening manuals of the time. This is, again, back 30 and 40 years ago. Most of those actually just told us how to kill insects. But it was clear I'd need to grow plants to attract insects that would in turn feed the birds and the frogs and the dragonflies and the bats and the snakes and everybody else I was getting to know. You get the idea. So I was having my first glimpses of the food web upon which all life depends, including, not incidentally, ours. So pretty quick came the next aha. If you want to grow insects, you have to learn what they, in turn, want to eat and provide it. So before long, my field guide collection wasn't just bird books, but insect books, too. And I guess with a last name like Roach, I shouldn't be surprised that that happened. Anyhow, suddenly I found myself learning about host plants, about insects who were diet specialists, which a staggering 90% of insect herbivores are, meaning they depend on the presence of a particular plant or plants in a specific family or genus. And that's where the real clincher revealed itself and the answer to why to grow native plants. Again and again, as I investigated what insects eat or otherwise interact with and depend upon, what came up were the native plants of a particular place, plants with ancient co-evolutionary relationships with the insects of that same place. And many plants, in turn, depend on the insects, too, for services like pollination, as we know. So why grow native plants? Well, without these intimate, ancient plant and animal matchups intact, things get pretty ugly, as we are seeing more and more. If we don't have the insects, Leo Wilson, one of Doug's scientific heroes, famously called the little things that run the world, food webs collapse. The right plants, carefully chosen native plants, are foundational in preventing that. So planting them is a vote in favor of biodiversity. And yes, you do get to see a lot more birds. I can tell you that will happen. So if I had started my garden journey a couple of decades later, the story I just told you would have been different. It would have been really, really streamlined because I would have had a guide named Doug Tallamy to show me the way. A teacher whose books don't include chapters on pest control, but rather lessons on how to keep more insects alive and well. So these days, each time I'm asked a question about some aspect of ecological horticulture in particular, which, by the way, has pretty quickly grabbed a big share of the attention away from old-style ornamental horticulture that I had written about for so many years and practiced. And that's in no small part thanks to today's speaker. Every time I'm asked a question about this, I hear an acronym in my head, which is WWDD. What would Doug do? So,
I'm just going to fix your mics.
Sorry.
Right next to you, I'm just going to fix your mics.
Okay.
I'll pick you up a little bit better.
Sorry. So I think what WWDD, what would Doug do? Because since not so long after his first book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published in 2007, it has been Doug Tallamy to whom an ever-increasing number of us have turned for guidance, myself included. Doug's a conservationist and an entomologist, a professor at the University of Delaware's Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology, and he's also a hands-on native plant gardener. He and his wife Cindy live on 10 rural acres in southeastern Pennsylvania, as they have for almost 25 years. And in the early years there in particular, they tackled areas that had grown thick with invasives, which led to a lot of physical hard work, but also to a shift in emphasis in Doug's career. While working to take back territory that the invasives had gobbled up, Doug the entomologist was struck by what he wasn't seeing, like how all those exotic plants were not being utilized by the native insects. Measuring insects' use of plants, both native and non-native, particularly by caterpillars, pretty quickly became a research focus and a subject he wanted to explore, not just in research, but also communicate about to a lay audience like ourselves. So, for instance, who among us today doesn't know, thanks to Doug, that caterpillars are the critically important baby food of the songbird set, and that oaks attract more of them than any other plant? You know, these are the kinds of things he's taught me, taught us. He's given us his string of highly acclaimed books and offered a schedule of more lectures than I've ever seen anyone else juggle year after year. He just does not stop. He's determined to spread the word, and he's so good at it because he's a brilliant translator, able to bring scientific concepts to life for those of us without a science background. Concepts like keystone plants, the real powerhouses of all natives, like those oaks. He's inspired in so many of us the desire to do better, to help, to foster biodiversity with the plant choices and garden management decisions we make, thanks to the concept he's illuminated for us. And he's never critical or condescending to those of us who want to keep our rose or our hosta, but he simply asks and encourages us to make room for natives, specifically by repurposing half the lawn, which he has taught us is like a dead zone in terms of diversity and also squanders resources such as water and is often chemically supported. And that idea of the lawn transformation is the foundational concept behind Homegrown National Park, the grassroots nonprofit he founded with Michelle Alfandari in 2020. If even half the more than 40 million acres of privately owned land that's currently managed as lawn was transformed, his thinking went, we homeowners could together contribute like 20 million acres of renewed diversity. Something I glance at in my bookshelf sometimes, I get up from my desk, is the copy of his 2020 book, Nature's Best Hope. You know, in my bookcase where I see the spine, and along the blue spine that faces out at me, it says from top to bottom, Douglas W. Tallamy. And then there's a little space, and below that it says, Nature's Best Hope. And I think that's about right. Nature's best hope is when a gifted scientist also possesses the skill of being able to make the science make sense for everyone and knows how to break it all down into goals we can grasp and accomplish. When that catalytic and tireless person is also great at connecting with a crowd like all of us here tonight and rallying us into joining him to each become part of nature's best hope too. Doug's made it his mission to get the word out about the unbreakable link between natives and native plants and native wildlife, speaking in behalf of nature and all its hungry citizens who just want to keep on sustaining themselves. He's taught us to act in their behalf too, one native plant at a time, while also relentlessly evicting every invasive that tries to get in the way like he and Cindy do at their place. I don't know if so many of us would have come as quickly to the punchline of taking action, of becoming part of the solution, part of the hope, if not for the gift of having such a great teacher. So with that, I give you Professor Doug Tallamy.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Now I'm too embarrassed to say anything. By the way, co-founder Michelle Alfandari is here. Where are you, Michelle? She's there. So she's a real person. Truth be told, it was my idea, but Michelle created everything else. So I did very little. All right, we're going to talk about, well, you know, Margaret just covered everything we're going to talk about. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these things, just in case you haven't heard some of it before. We're going to talk about Homegrown National Park. And the title is, What's the Rush? Well, E.O. Wilson told us what the rush was. He says, conservation is a discipline with a deadline. And it's so true. We don't have hundreds of years to make a difference here. So we're going to talk about that, maybe. But before we do that, I want to ask you what that is. Looks like a fecal sac. You know, birds in a nest, they don't want their babies to poop in the nest, so they've evolved this little sac, and you put the poops in the sac, and the parents pick up the sac, and they fly out and drop it, and that way you don't soil the nest. And that sac falls on a vegetation, and that's what that thing looked like. It's actually a spider. It's a bola spider, and at night it really looks like a bola spider. It hangs from a leaf and drops a single strand of silk with one sticky glob of glue at the end, and it goes hunting. Now you would think a web would be a better way to catch things, but no, moths do fly in and get caught. She spins them around very quickly, wraps them up in silk, and has a nice meal. Then she cuts it loose, and then she goes hunting again, and another moth comes in, and she spins that around and sucks on that, and she gets another one. And after she's had enough moths, she's got enough energy to create an egg mass. She's got another moth there. There's an egg mass. It's in a beautiful silken pouch, and if hunting's really good, she can make 2 or 3 egg masses and hang them in a row, and that's how they spend the winter. So you can find these egg masses all winter long on your trees. The real question is, why are moths flying into that little single target? Turns out it's not an accident. She's releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. So the moths that are flying in are all males, because they think she's a female. She is, but she's the wrong species. And they fly in, and they get caught. And I wanted to know what the species of moth was that she was imitating the sex pheromone in my yard. So I unwound the little bodies that were underneath her little perch there and found out it was the bronze cutworm. And I have bronze cutworm males in my yard because I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars, and I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars because I've got goldenrod, which is their major host plant. I also have this beautiful moth, dot line white, because I've got oak trees, primarily white oaks, and because I don't rake the leaves from underneath those trees. There is a dot line white cocoon in that leaf litter. Can you see it? No. Can you see it now, maybe? Can you see it now? There it is in the middle. Point is, you're not going to see it when you're raking leaves. And when you rake your leaves away, you're raking away a lot of life forms. I have evening primrose moths in our yard because I planted evening primrose specifically to attract that moth. And it worked. They came. The moth spends the day with its head stuck in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it works really well. I have zebra swallowtails because I planted pawpaws, which is the only host plant for their caterpillars. And again, we did that on purpose. We wanted to attract that beautiful swallowtail. The point is, it would take me a long time, at least a week, to describe all the life forms that now are calling our home, our house, their home. But it wouldn't take very long to describe all the things that live in a typical residential landscape. And that's because a typical residential landscape has no goldenrod, which means it has no bronze cutworms, which means it has no bola spiders. Many of them don't have any oak trees, so they don't have any dot line whites. They don't have any evening primroses, so they don't have evening primrose moth. They don't have pawpaws, so they don't have zebra swallowtails. You get the picture. There's very little that can make a living in a typical residential landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in this country, which is 5 times larger than all the land we've allocated to our national park system. And we're not finished. We're still developing 800,000 new acres of residential landscapes every year in the U.S. And that's why we're seeing some scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Recent paper just a few months ago says we lost 22%, or butterfly populations have declined 22% just since the year 2000. And they weren't doing all that well in the year 2000 either. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is already gone. 40% of Earth's plants are facing extinction. The UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. They made that prediction 3 years ago. And all of that put together is why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write this book, The Sixth Extinction, talking about the sixth great extinction event that the Earth has ever experienced. Not a prediction, it's already happening. But this is the first one to be caused by a living being, and you know who that is. Now, I've been actually pleased at the response of the general public to all of these nasty headlines. I didn't think people would care very much, particularly the headline that says we're losing our insects. I thought people would be celebrating. We've been trying to kill insects forever. But I was wrong. People do care. They're sending me emails. What are we going to do? And in fact, it's now an area of study. Scientists are studying what our reaction to the news that we're losing life on planet Earth is. And Richard Hobbs is one of those people. You've written a couple of papers on it. He says it's very similar, our response is very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we hear we have a terminal disease. There's denial, and we certainly have a lot of that out there. Well, we don't really have a problem. Anger, I feel that sometimes. I think you all do. Bargaining, well, maybe it's not so bad, we can do something. Depression, I think we all feel that. And then stage 5 is acceptance. And this is where we have to push back because acceptance is the same thing as giving up. And giving up on nature is not an optional, because nature is not optional. So we need a 5th stage, we'll call it action. There are things we can do to not just slow biodiversity loss, but reverse it. We do have parks, we do have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but you know, our parks, particularly our national parks, were established because they were exquisitely beautiful places. And Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to do with that, and this is what he said. He said, the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back. That's okay. Of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. So in other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in, which is one of the reasons they were not created with the idea of conservation in mind, and that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the U.S. in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected. Other countries, by the way, many other countries are doing a lot better than that. But we do have parks, we do have preserves, we have land conservancies, and this acreage is starting to build up. That's good. But we have to ask the question, why aren't these parks and these preserved places enough to preserve the amount of biodiversity that we humans need? And there are several answers to that, but the big one is they're too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down to just a fraction of its former self, and that's essentially what we've done all over the country, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times they go up, in bad times they go down. If you're a large population, this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, the bottom line, in those normal cycles, and every population cycles, you hit 0. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize that habitat patch, you're permanently gone, which is called local extinction. And recolonization these days is harder and harder. Picture a box turtle crossing a major highway. It just doesn't happen anymore. And there are studies all over the world, some of them quite lengthy, more than 100 years in length, telling us the same thing. We have not preserved enough of the natural world to preserve the amount of biodiversity that we humans need to run the ecosystems that we all depend on. We tend to use extinction as a metric of trouble, but I don't like that, because that's like going to the doctor when you're dead. It's too late. So there's something called defaunation. What we really should be measuring is when the common species that actually run our ecosystems start to decline in abundance. They're not extinct, but they're declining in abundance. And we've got all kinds of examples of that around. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. Not long ago, it was one of the most common bumblebees in the entire country. But now if you see one, it's a big deal. I've never seen one. They're on the brink of extinction. So they're not extinct, but they're no longer performing their roles in their ecosystems. American beavers, same thing. When Europeans came here, beavers had established the hydrology of the entire country. Major rivers, small streams, everything. We essentially trapped them all out. Now, not every last one. There's a few beavers here and there. And when they act like a beaver, we trap them and move them someplace else. So the hydrology is still changed. Recent study says that the birds that are declining, the ones we measure declining, they're the most common birds that are declining, not the rare ones. So it's showing that that's a perfect example of defaunation. So defaunation is the reduction in the abundance of the species that are actually running our ecosystems. It's local, it's happening everywhere, and we tend not to even notice. And we tend not to notice because of this phenomenon called shifting baseline. We think that the way things were when we were kids is the way they always were and the way they always should be. It's normal to us. So if you're born into a world that is defaunated, it's not unusual. You don't notice it. None of us missed the passenger pigeon because it was gone before any of us were born. It was the most common bird on the entire planet. So shifting baseline means that we are losing the biodiversity that sustains us, and we're not even noticing it. Edwin Waiteel, decades ago, said, "We cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves." It's the most basic common sense. So what should we do? Well, there actually is some good news. The biodiversity crisis is now part of the global discussion. The UN has met 3 times to talk about the biodiversity crisis. The latest one was a world meeting in Paris, I believe, in May, if I recall correctly. The only country not to go to that meeting was the US. But the UN, they get together and they say, we've got a big problem, and they pass resolutions, and then we ignore them. Not a single resolution that the UN has passed since 1990 about biodiversity loss has been met. What about what E.O. Wilson told us to do? The late E.O. Wilson, a wonderful man who he really had his scientific act together. Conservation was a major concern of E.O. throughout his entire career, and in 2016 he put it all into a single book. He called it Half Earth. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. Very bold statement. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. But then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half. We can be in the other half, and it'll be great. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. And we got I used to say 8.2 billion, but now it's 8.3 billion people in the other half. Along with all of our hardscape, our roadways, our airports, our detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, I really think we can. I do think we can. And that really is what Homegrown National Park is all about. We need a new approach to conservation to do that. We have got to give up the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist, cannot be in the same place at the same time. Not only can we coexist, not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. So we're not just going to practice conservation in pristine areas. We're now going to practice conservation where we actually live. But look, there's nothing to conserve there. So we have to go beyond conservation now. We have to move into restoration. We have to put it back. And it's entirely possible to do that. But in order to put it back successfully, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not be an uninvited guest, but thrive. And we hear about habitat fragmentation all the time as being the major problem or one of the major problems, and it is a major problem. What we've done is we've taken viable habitats around the world and reduced them to tiny little islands of what they used to be, and they're separated from each other, so they're isolated and they're small. We already talked about the problems of being small. So what has been proposed is to create biological corridors that connect those isolated habitat fragments with each other so that plants and animals can move back and forth between habitats, and that will end one of the major problems with isolation, and that is inbreeding depression, where you end up breeding with your close relatives. So that should really help inbreeding depression. But it should be obvious the major problem remains. The habitats themselves are still tiny. So when the populations fluctuate within them, they will still hit zero and blink out over time. So I think what we need to do is not just make biological corridors that connect habitats, but make viable habitats in between viable habitats. Yes, that will connect them. And we're going to do that by putting plants back. So that's better, and that's even better. The lighter areas here will be where our major cities and farms are. But these areas are we're going to put the plants back. That's what it really boils down to. What are those areas? It's our private property. It's where we live. It's where we work. It's where we play, where we worship. Which means to achieve this, we need a new attitude about property rights. We've got this idea that we humans can own a piece of the earth, and we can do whatever we want with that little piece of the earth. But you know, our yards are not like Las Vegas. You know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Right? Michelle, you know that? Yeah. Not true of our properties. You know, what happens on our properties does not stay on our property. Either for good or for bad, whatever we do on our properties impacts the local ecosystem. And that's something we haven't been thinking about. Let's look at what happens when we decide we're going to have a big lawn. That means you're determining whether rain is going to infiltrate when you have a storm, like we might have in another few minutes, or whether it's going to leave as stormwater runoff. And when it leaves as stormwater runoff, is it going to pollute the local watershed by carrying the pesticides and the fertilizers, the insecticides that we typically put on our lawns right into that watershed? We're also determining how much carbon we're adding to the atmosphere every time we mow that lawn. We're also determining, this is what we're doing with our property, we're determining whether we're going to have viable habitat for our pollinators. If you have a lawn the way you're supposed to have a lawn, you will have no habitat for your pollinators. The plants you decide to put in that lawn, on that property, are going to determine how much carbon you're sequestering, how much carbon you're pulling out of the atmosphere and tying up in those plant tissues. Plants, of course, build their tissues out of the carbon they separate from carbon dioxide, and then they pump the extra carbon they fix through photosynthesis into the ground through their root system. And once it's in the ground, once it's in the soil, it's very, very stable. Our plant choices are going to determine whether we're harboring ecological tumors, those invasive plants that don't stay on our properties. They escape, and then they ecologically castrate all the land around us. And then finally, our plant choices are going to determine how well we're supporting the local food web. Are we choosing plants that are sharing some of the energy they capture from the sun with other organisms? So how we landscape, how much lawn we have, and our plant choices are going to determine how much life our properties can support. And that is an awesome responsibility. And unfortunately, it's an awesome responsibility that most landowners don't know that they have. It also creates, though, an opportunity, a grassroots opportunity, as Margaret said, to help solve this biodiversity crisis. There are millions of us out there. There are millions of property owners out there, and everybody can become part of the conservation solution if we treat those properties properly. Why am I saying that? Because most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country, the lower 48 states, is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And remember, failure is not an option. So collectively, that makes property owners the hope and the future of conservation. Let's return to lawn. It's my favorite thing to pick on because we got a lot of it. We got 44 million acres of lawn now, which is an area bigger than all of New England combined, and it's dedicated to an ecological deadscape. So the question is, why do we do that? Well, lawn's a status symbol. It's a very important status symbol. We like neat. It is easy to keep lawn neat. And of course, we have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? So let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That gives us that 20 million acres that Margaret talked about that we're going to make Homegrown National Park out of. And 20 million acres, when you add it all up, is a lot. It's bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks together, and it's still less than 20 million acres. So step one in Homegrown National Park is to get that 20 million acres of lawn restored, and it will be the biggest national park in the country. So this was our original design of Homegrown National Park. The idea is to get you on the biodiversity map. Here's another version of it. And by the way, Canada has joined us. It's not just the US now. What we're asking is that people register their property on the biodiversity map, the location, and then the amount of area that you are being a good steward of or you're going to be a good steward of. So if you're actually reducing the area of lawn, you're going to measure that and you're going to record that in our database. If you're going to plant an oak tree, for example, put a bed around it, you're measuring that space. If you're removing invasive species, you're measuring that space. If you're putting an aster in a flower pot, that is okay. You can still be a member of Homegrown National Park. That all goes into our database, and then your little piece of your county lights up with a firefly. I've got my little firefly right here. That's our emblem. Of course, it means we're lighting up everybody's, I don't know, what does it mean, Michelle? Yeah, lighting yourself, there you go. So what's our mission? It's to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity, by using the plants that support it, by removing the plants that don't. And in that way, we're going to create a culture that is sympathetic to the needs of conservation. Our general culture today is, we're getting there, but we're not sympathetic enough to the needs of conservation. You know, if you look, I don't want to get off track here, but if you look at the 10 most important things that people worry about in election years, conservation is not on that list. It ought to be number one. It ought to be number one. This is where our national parks are today. When Homegrown National Park is in full swing, it's going to look like that. Shouldn't be too hard. Yeah. Okay, there are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park. Significant increase in biodiversity is one of them, and I'll give you a few examples in a minute of how well this works. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed, let's just talk about the invasive plants. If you remove the invasive plants just from your property, we'd be 78% done countrywide. We'd be 85% done in the east. Not completely, but it's a very good first step. Significant drawdown in atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. If we reduce the area that's in lawn, with anything else, you're going to sequester a lot more carbon. And that helps climate change, of course. And then finally, we're going to create viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of habitat, any bit of conservation you do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. I think equally important, though, are the sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not just there for our entertainment. It's not optional. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, whether you like it or not. And that means everybody has responsibility to help sustain it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations out there into, get the successful conservation they're doing recorded on the biodiversity map. Homegrown National Park is not a conservation organization. It is a movement. We're trying to organize all of the conservation organizations together. We are all trying to accomplish the same thing. So we think of ourselves as a movement. When you take areas like this and you turn them into that, it means we've got to take areas like this and turn it into that. Notice, we have not ejected humans from that space. That happens to be my mother-in-law's old house. And when they built that house, it was on a cornfield. And it didn't take that long for it to be a viable habitat around that house. So we can do that pretty much everywhere. Did I mention the Homegrown National Park is free? Again, we're a movement. We're not an organization. We're not trying to pull membership away from other organizations. We just want to record the healthy conservation that people are doing in other spaces. You can still be a member of Audubon or any of the land conservancies and join Homegrown National Park. But again, there is urgency in enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. Remember that 135 million acres of residential landscapes we talked about? That's a big job. So we all need to get to work, but we have to understand what it is we're supposed to be doing to succeed. There's a lot of things we can do to succeed, but there's 4 major ecological responsibilities that every landscape, every property has. Every property has to support a viable food web. If you don't have a viable food web on that property, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have a functioning ecosystem. Every property has to sequester carbon to help climate change. Every property has to manage the watershed in which it lies. Nobody gets a buy. The property you're looking at there is a house down the street from me. He's a nice guy, but he's destroying my watershed, and he doesn't know it. And every property has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it all the time. Plant choice. Plant choice matters. Plant choice matters a whole lot. So we have to understand the types of plants that are out there. There are 3 types of plants that are out there. Plants that contribute energy to local food webs. Remember, they're capturing energy from the sun, they're turning it into food. Will they pass some of that energy on and support a food web or not? Contributors do pass it on. Non-contributors, they capture energy, but they don't pass it on. And detractors actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. I'm always talking about oaks, but there's a reason I'm talking about oaks. They are the best contributors to food webs. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding any energy, not passing its energy on. And a good example of a detractor would be any of our invasive ornamentals. They've escaped our yards, and now they're pushing out the contributors that do support local food webs. So the end result, the net result, is a loss of energy from that food web. We often have to appreciate how important caterpillars are. They are not little worms. They are essential components of terrestrial food webs. As a matter of fact, caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater, which is why Dan Jansen, very famous ecologist, calls them the meat and potatoes or the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. If you don't have a lot of caterpillars, particularly in your temperate zone food webs, you're going to have a failed food web, and then eventually a failed ecosystem. And that's why we talk about keystone plants. Keystone plants are the ones that make the most food in the form of caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is? It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of the local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food, which means they're supporting most of the caterpillars. Just 14% of our native plants, the keystone plants, are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that drive our food webs. So I like to think of keystone plants as the 2x4s that hold the ecological house we're building up in our yards. They're the support system. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do with our ornamental plants for the last century. How do you know what the best keystone species are? You go to this tool in the National Wildlife Federation website, Native Plant Finder, put in your zip code and the ranked list of the most important woody plant genera and herbaceous plant genera. And the lists are much bigger than that, but I ran out of room. Those ranked lists will pop up for your county. So as you move around the country, this changes a little bit. The most important plants change. But now, the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is just an excuse. We do know what to plant now. Go to Native Plant Finder. I have to talk briefly, in case somebody hasn't heard this, why it's native plant. Why do we have to plant native plants? Why don't non-native plants support the caterpillars and the biodiversity that we're talking about? And there's still people arguing about this, particularly in California. I just had to write something to try to convince them. It turns out, and as Margaret said, 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists, and they have been forced to specialize because the plants don't want to be eaten. They are capturing the energy from the sun, but they want to use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it is a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But it takes a long period. The insects that do eat plants are able to do that because they come up with very specialized adaptations that allow them to get around those chemical defenses. But one set of adaptations for one plant does not work for other plants, which means this is where the specialization comes in. Once you specialize on one plant, you are locked into eating that particular plant. And it takes a long time for those insects to develop other specialized adaptations. A great example is, of course, the monarch butterfly. We know a lot about monarchs. We know they are specialists on milkweeds, and we know a lot about milkweeds. We know they're toxic plants. They're loaded with cardiac glycosides, and they're also loaded with sticky, milky latex sap. Well, the monarchs have the physiological ability to detoxify cardiac glycosides. They have enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds. Works really well for them. But what about the sticky latex sap? How did they get around that? When you break open a milkweed leaf, all this white goo comes out. And if you leave it on your finger for a minute, it gels. It turns into like chewing gum. And that's its defensive property. If that gets smeared on the mouth parts of a caterpillar, it glues their mouth shut. And then they starve to death. Very effective defense. So how do monarchs eat milkweeds? You can watch this on your milkweed. The monarch caterpillar will crawl onto a new leaf, and the first thing it does is go to the end of the leaf and it starts to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, it'll stop eating immediately, turn around, go back up the leaf, about 2/3 of the way, and it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews till it's completely severed the midrib. And what it's done is block the canals that shunt the latex sap from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. Then it can turn around, go back down, and it can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. It's a very simple behavioral adaptation, but it's one most insects have not figured out how to do. It also flags the leaves. So if you're a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road and look at a milkweed patch, and if you've got flagged leaves there, you know you have monarch caterpillars. So those are the upsides of specialization. The monarch is now able, by specializing in that one genus of plants, it is now able to eat a plant that most other insects are unable to eat. There is a downside to specialization, though, and that is that now that's all monarchs can eat. There are 2,137 native plant genera in North America, and monarchs can only eat one. Host plant specialization, and the take-home message here is that monarchs aren't special. 90% of the insects that eat plants have the same level of specialization. So if we take away the native plants in which they specialize, we're going to lose those insects. And we have measured this a number of times in my lab. What happens when we take away those plants, either in our yards or when we allow invasive species to push them out? This is one experiment, very simple one I did with an undergrad a few years ago. We went into hedgerows that were invaded with non-natives, and you'll recognize autumn olive and multiflora rose and all the other things we have in our hedgerows. We measured caterpillar populations in a standardized way in those hedgerows and compared them to hedgerows that did not have any invasive species. The real trick was finding hedgerows with no invasive species. And what we found was a 68% reduction in the number of caterpillar species in the invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars. The amount of energy that was actually in those invaded or uninvaded hedgerows. If you think of caterpillars as bird food, that's a 96% reduction in bird food. So if you're wondering why we're losing our birds, starving them is one of the reasons. Another thing we have to think about and accept are many of the wonderful things that E.O. Wilson wrote about. He is gone, but his writings are not gone, and we should read them every day. And as Margaret said, one of the things he said is that insects are the little things that run the world, and that life as we know it depends on those insects. So our everyday war against insects really needs to stop. If insects were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems. So much so that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. And I will remind you, humans are mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot, because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Something we should think about every day. Remember what happens if we lose our pollinators? We've got to save the pollinators, and we're doing much better at that. And we hear about pollinator pathways and pollinator initiatives all over the country, so that is great. But the reason I hear we need to save our pollinators is a little off. I always hear we need to save our pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops, as if that's the only reason. That's not even correct. They pollinate about a 12th of our crops. We need to save pollinators everywhere, not just in agriculture, because they are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, including a few of our crops. So it's simply not an option. We have to appreciate the ecological value of our leaves. We're hearing more and more about this, but leaves do a number of very important things. They're protecting soil moisture. Everything that lives in the soil depends on high levels of humidity and moisture. And there are more species that live in the soil than above the soil. And leaves create a blanket over the soil, protecting that soil moisture. They also prevent soil erosion. So if you have bare soil and you get a big rainstorm, it takes the topsoil away. Leaves are recycling the nutrients that your trees used the year before. All the nutrients they use are tied up in those leaves. When the leaves drop to the ground, if you don't get those nutrients back into the soil, and you do that year after year, you're starving your tree. Most of our trees don't live nearly as long as they used to, and that's one of the reasons. So we need to get those nutrients back into the soil, and leaves themselves are habitats for lots of things, like that dot line white I told you. Now the reason we're raking them away is we have this idea that our plants are unable to grow through normal layers of leaf litter. But I ask you, who was raking the leaves before we got here? And there were plants in North America. I read about it. They're much better at getting through our leaves than we think. Now, I don't rake my leaves at home because I shouldn't and because I'm not at home. But this is what happens. That is spring, and these are violets coming up, little delicate violets just coming up through leaf litter under my shingle oak tree. So there they are. Here they are about a week later, a little bit later, and finally in full bloom. Didn't rake any of those leaves at all. So we rake more than we need to. We have to recognize how deadly our light pollution at night is in terms of insects. We now know that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines around the world, and those are all the ways that our lights are killing insects, particularly the moths that make those all-important caterpillars we talked about. And we've got a lot of lights out there. We probably have more lights every day out there. So what can we do? Well, you can put a motion sensor on your lights, which means they only turn on when the bad man comes. That's okay. Even easier is to take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, because yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we'd save millions of insects, and if we use yellow LEDs, and a recent experiment just showed they're even more effective than yellow incandescent lights, we would save millions of dollars too. We've got to replace mosquito fogging with things that actually control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage, and the downside of mosquito fogging in the adult stage is that it kills everything else as well. Many of the mosquito fogging companies say it's an organic, natural product that only kills mosquitoes. And if that were true, I might hire them too. But organic, maybe it's pyrethroids made by chrysanthemums. Natural, cyanide is an organic, natural product too, but that doesn't make it all that nice. Only kills mosquitoes. That's not even close to being true. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake a few years ago. My friend happened to be there, and he picked up a handful of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. It was during a major migration event. I've got a student right now who's studying non-target effects of mosquito fogging. She's looked at 6 species of caterpillars and adult moths. It kills them all within 24 hours. Not spraying them directly, just having them sit on the vegetation that was sprayed. So mosquito dunks, we don't have time to go into it in any detail, but it is an option for controlling mosquitoes in the larval stage. That's where we want to control our mosquitoes. We also want to think about the conservation potential of small properties. 82% of us live in cities. The properties are small, not like many of the big properties around here. And a lot of people think, well, we can't do any conservation in cities. But we can, particularly if everybody does it. Then those properties aren't small anymore. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago, 100% native landscape except for the little bit of lawn there. She's recorded 127 species of birds that have used her property. And it's only 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. So we can be effective on small properties. This is a little space in front of our friend's house. Those are wood poppies and violets. So you can make attractive properties. And if you have no front yard, you can do container gardening. Let's say you live in an apartment complex that has a balcony. If that balcony is blank, as it is on most apartment complexes, this is a pile of bricks. But if everybody did container gardening, then you've got a valuable resource for urban bees. And there's a lot of species of bees trying to make it in urban situations. We were in a small town in Washington State this summer, and I actually saw this. Those are all ornamental decorations, but they could be native plants, and that's what our balconies could look like. So now you have the question, what are the plants that do best in containers? And that resource is now available on our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. You can go and find out the best native plants for containers in your ecoregion. So there's another great big unknown solved. Now fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against both climate change and the biodiversity crisis. We can work on both of them at the same time. And that is that conservation works. Got lots of examples of how conservation works. This is Nachusa grasslands. 3,000, it's in Illinois, 3,800 acres. 730 native plant species have been recorded there. Over 180 species of birds have been recorded. It used to be a cornfield. Real conservation success. This is Mentor Marsh in Ohio. It was the largest stand of Phragmites, common reed, in the entire state. 811 acres of Phragmites. They got rid of it. It is now a vibrant freshwater marsh. There's a couple of rare and endangered freshwater plants in that marsh now. What's really encouraging to me is you don't hear very many success stories with Phragmites, but this is one. It shows it can be done. This is Sibley Regional Park in California. There's a man by the name of Glenn Schneider who every weekend of the year leads a group of dedicated volunteers up that side of that mountain. They each have a little hand whacker and a bottle of vinegar. And they get on their hands and knees, and what they do is they whack out the invasive grasses. Most of California is covered with grasses brought in for cattle. Well, they whack them out, and that's all they do. Look what comes back. Look what is still in the seed bank. Fantastic success. And this is where Cindy and I live. That's what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. It was part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. Old farm, farmed almost 300 years, and the last thing they did was to mow it for hay. Now, when you mow for hay in southeast Pennsylvania, you're really mowing the rootstocks of all the invasives that are there. Bush honeysuckle, multiflora rose, Oriental bittersweet, autumn olive, Japanese honeysuckle. And when you stop mowing, which they did 3 years before we actually moved in, that's what comes back. So we had 10 acres of impenetrable Asian plants. And I don't want to minimize how much work it is to get rid of those, but it's easier when you get your spouse to do it. And when your spouse is done, then you can put the native plants back, which is what we have been doing. And the question is, has life returned? And you can measure life any way you want. I'm measuring it in 2 ways. The number of species of birds that are breeding there. Breeding is the important time. And the number of species of moths that allows them to breed there. That's what they're feeding on. And I've been counting. It's easy to find the bird nests and count them. The moths, a little bit harder. You put out lights at night, and anytime I find one, I take a picture of it. So I've been taking pictures of moths on our property. It's probably been 9 years now. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,364 species of moths that I've recorded on that property because we put the plants back. And many of them are really cool creatures, like the chinkapin leaf miner and the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor. They've got great names. The little devil, the horrid zalie, the forgotten frigid owlet. It's terrible. Obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, there is an implicit arches as well. The snowy shouldered eclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink-shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, lemon plagotis, the three-patched bigwing, the cynical quaker, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three-spot, the confused woodgrain, the slowpoke, the tearful underwing, the eyed pectes, the hog sphinx, the tufted bird-dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird-dropping moth on their property? The spun glass caterpillar, that's my favorite. And hundreds of other species have come back to our property, again, because we put the plants they need back. And the question I get is, how come you have any plants? Why aren't these guys eating everything you have on your property? And the answer is, remember, they're the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. Everything is eating them. How about those birds? We have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our property, and each one of those birds is eating hundreds of caterpillars every day. I'm surprised I can find any caterpillars at all. And some days I can't. The birds are eating them. We've got a lot of insect predators that are eating caterpillars and other insects, like ambush bugs, like assassin bugs, predatory stink bugs. This guy sat next to this aggregation of milkweed tussock moth. That's what they look like when they're young. And he ate one every single day. And then there were fewer. Parasitoids, got a lot of hymenopteran parasitoids. Almost all of them are hitting caterpillars. They're laying their eggs in the caterpillars, killing them. We've got other wasps that prey on the caterpillars themselves. They sting the caterpillar, paralyze it, and then carry it back to their nest. And the reason they're paralyzing it and not killing it is that's nature's form of refrigeration. So the caterpillar is still alive. It's not going to rot. If they killed the caterpillar and then laid an egg on it, it would rot before the egg even hatched. But this way, it's nice and fresh so the egg can hatch and eat it alive. But we got a lot of other things eating our insects. We've got skunks, actually not very many. We've only seen 2 skunks in 25 years, but we've got possums, we've got raccoons, foxes. 25% of a red fox's diet is insects. We've got spring peepers, Saw one this morning, even though it wasn't spring. We've got green frogs, we've got toads, we've got wood frogs. Wood frogs colonized our little teeny pond last year for the first time in 24 years. It was a great event. We've got salamanders, we've got ringneck snakes, we've got the cutest little gray tree frogs that happen to be green when they're young. So we've got a balanced food web, keeping all those caterpillars in check. But our lawn goals are too modest. Believe it or not, 20 million acres is not good enough, and that's because most of the privately owned land out there is in small woodlots, it's in cropland, and it's in rangeland. Now, I don't have time to talk about cropland and rangeland tonight, but let's talk a little bit about small woodlots. We got 406 million acres in privately owned woodlots that are not managed by logging companies. They're managed by people like you folks. And by managed, I mean you're managing the lumber, but you also have to manage the invasive species load, and that is going to determine the biodiversity value of those woodlots. So how do you manage invasive species? By managing your deer. There's a direct connection between how invasive a plant is and whether or not the deer likes it. We used to think that our invasive plants were super plants. We brought them over from Asia, and everything from Asia is a super plant, and it can outcompete anything from North America. And there people say, well, then they deserve to be here. But it's just that we brought these plants over without their natural enemies. They have no insects that eat them, the diseases aren't here, and the deer don't like them. The deer do like our native plants. So this is what it looks like when you've got too many deer. They eat all the natives. You have no forest regeneration. Forest health is seriously compromised. This actually is part of what my property looks like now. That's Japanese stilt grass, no understory, and we had a lot of deer. And that is no forest regeneration. This is a map created by the Nature Conservancy of New York State, and what I want you to look at is the green area, because that's the only place forests are regenerating in a healthy way in New York State. That's a serious, serious problem, and we're blaming most of it on the deer. Now, I went to Great Smoky Mountains a couple springs ago, and the first thing I noticed was the wonderful understory in those forests. I hadn't seen understory. I forgot what it looked like. Hadn't seen it in a long time. And I asked the ranger I was with, how come you've got understory? How are you controlling your deer? And he said, we don't control our deer at all. I said, well, how come you have understory? He said, we've got black bear, we've got bobcats, and we have coyotes, and we don't shoot them. So they don't have wolves, which are the major deer predator, but they have enough predators to keep the deer within the carrying capacity of that forest, which means they've got young canopy trees. Most of the understory of a forest are young canopy trees that will replace the adult canopy trees when they die. And of course, another serious downside of too many deer is Lyme disease. And this summer, I had my 6th case of Lyme disease. So again, we're not going to talk about that either, but these are serious downsides to not controlling our deer. Okay, there's something that's common to all of these conservation approaches, and that is whether or not they work depends on decisions that you and I make. I gave a final exam a couple of years ago, and one of the students in the exam, Amanda Crandall, this was part of her answer. She said, well, conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats. What we're actually managing is people, and that is so true. We need to change our adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative one. That is the only viable path forward. And the question is, can we do this? Of course we can do this. At least I think we can. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save biodiversity where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are concerned about the state of the planet, and they feel, what can one person do? Well, there's a number of things one person can do. One person can shrink the lawn. One person can change their light bulb. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can use keystone plants. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can remove their invasive plants. One person can do a whole bunch to revitalize the ecological contributions of their little piece of the earth and enhance their greater local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed. Just worry about that piece of the earth that you can manage. If you own properties, that's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy. Help a park or preserve. They are all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. Robert Swan recently said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else, folks. It's going to be you. I'll help a little bit. Margaret will help. But it's going to be you. That's because you are nature's best hope. So I hope that Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation, the guidance, the community for millions of people to tackle these really serious conservation challenges. Because how we act now is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. So thank you very much. There are the websites that I talked about. And I guess we're going to do our Q&A now. So there's what, a couple hundred of you, each one has a card? Only a couple hundred questions, that's good.
Yeah. Was it? Okay. While we're waiting for Avalon to come up, I also wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to thank those that helped make this possible and really bring Doug here. So the Columbia Land Conservancy sponsored this. Brielle Long is one of our staff here that did a lot in prepping this, so I want to thank Brielle as part of that. We also had a couple of key sponsors for this. New Leaf Eco Landscapes was one of our sponsors. And the second sponsor was Arthur Points Farm. And I want to make sure we acknowledge all of them. Good with the questions? All right. Back to you. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you all so much, and thank you immensely. I'm going to move it over there. Okay, and then I'll thank you more, so you can actually hear it. Okay? Thank you, Doug. I'm a little speechless, which I know a lot of folks in the audience, and they know that's not a usual situation for me, but I'm in the presence of some of my most immense native plant heroes here tonight, and it's an honor and a pleasure, and especially a pleasure to be here under the auspices of Columbia Land Conservancy, which is one of my favorite things about living in Columbia County, is the Land Conservancy and all of the conservation work that is done to such a high degree all over the county and of course beyond in the Hudson Valley. So I know all of you are a big part of that, and I'm just so grateful to be standing up here with your good questions for Doug Tallamy. So I haven't had a chance to look at them. We're going to shuffle as we go. We have questions I think I'm seeing about deer, about invasive plants, about different native plant species that we might have in our gardens, about climate change. We have many, many, many interesting questions, and I think we're just going to kind of take them as they come. So I want to start with a question that I know is coming from Columbia Land Conservancy, and that's about, you tonight and Margaret Roach have emphasized the critical importance of planting native for so many myriad reasons. And sometimes we have a question about how do we define native? And what is in particular the value of planting species that may not be historically native in our area, but may be native slightly farther south? We may predict that those species are coming to our area due to climate change. I've heard this called assisted migration or neo-natives. Kind of where do you come down on what's native and what's okay?
Okay, there's several questions in there. What is native? You know, I'm interested in restoring food webs, so I'm interested in planting plants that other things are adapted to eat, which means those plants have shared an evolutionary history with the animals around them. Where they shared that history could change a little bit. You know, when the glaciers came down, it pushed all the plants down to the Gulf Coast, and then they came back. So the specific location of a community has changed over the years, but the association of the plants with the animals around it is what makes it a native. When you bring in, let's say we bring in the Colorado blue spruce, it grows fine here, grows fine in Delaware, but it evolved in the Colorado Rockies, so it's not even close to the community of organisms that it interacted with. Yes, it's from North America, but it's not part of the ecosystems that we're planting it in. So, you know, there's some flexibility here. Now, some people are really rigid about this. They want you to, a native is only something that is going to be part of the same genotype of plants right around you. Very, very narrow definition. I'm a little broader that way. I want it to be able to feed local things, but local food webs can be quite large. So for example, if I'm a caterpillar and I eat American beech occurs from Canada all the way down to Florida and all the way west to the Mississippi. I could take a beech from any of those places and the caterpillar would eat it. It'd be just fine. So you know, like black locust, it's really, quote, native to the Ohio River Valley. If we plant it here, is it not native? Well, it's going to support the things that have been associated with it here or in the Ohio Valley. So to me, I consider it a native. That's a little bit looser definition than many other people do. Let's talk about assisted migration. For the same reason, I'm not a great fan of that. Now that doesn't mean you're not allowed to plant a southern plant up here if you want to, but as a major solution to climate change, I'm not a great fan for two reasons. First of all, climate change is not a gentle warming of the planet. We can simply move things north. It's an increase in climate variability. The jet stream, which used to gently go across North America, above it was a little bit colder and below it a little bit warmer. Now it's going like this. Wild swings. When it goes far north, it's way warmer than it ought to be in the north. When it goes far south, it's way colder. Last year, Baton Rouge had 9 inches of snow, and it got down to 9 degrees. It even killed native plants down there. So these wild swings, and they're happening more and more every single year. The polar vortices, whatever plural is, they're going to keep coming. And if we move our southern plants up, I don't think it's going to go well for them. But just as important is we're moving them away from the community they evolved with. We did a study looking at red oak, which is one of the primary supporters of caterpillars in the east. It's planted as an ornamental in Portland, Oregon. I looked at it over there. Absolutely nothing eats it in Portland, Oregon. So that's not a north-south grading, it's an east-west grading, but it's removed from the organisms that co-evolve with it. There are caterpillars in Portland, but none of them recognized red oak. So keeping the plants within the community in which they're going to be productive, I think, is important. What I hope happens is that we have enough genetic variability in our plant communities so that they actually can adapt to the crazy swings we're throwing at them. And the real solution is to stop throwing those crazy climate change variables at them. So, I don't know, long answer.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was like 4 questions at once, so
Okay, yeah.
well handled. And actually a great segue into the next question in my hand, which is another very big picture one about, let's talk about the connection between biodiversity loss and climate change, and or the converse, saving biodiversity and mitigating or otherwise helping ourselves out of the climate mess that we're in. So
Yeah.
I'm seeing here that some experts say it's important to preserve biodiversity to fix climate change. How might that be, or is that so? Or
Some
how are-
experts say what?
that it's important to preserve biodiversity to fix climate change. Is that so, or how are those two crises interrelated, and how might their solutions also be related?
I'm not sure what they mean by that. I do know that a third of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now has come from us removing the plants on the planet, particularly our trees. We've been chopping them down for the last 2,000 years, and all that carbon is floating around up there now. If we put those trees back, if we put the plants back, and I'm talking about the prairie systems, the 44 million acres of lawn, if we put plants back, we can pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. It will not solve climate change, but it will certainly help. It'll be one of the tools that we need to employ. And there is the Trillion Tree campaign around the world to do just that, put trees back, which is great as long as they put the right trees back. Putting a trillion eucalyptus around the world is not going to, I mean, you might as well fight the biodiversity crisis at the same time. Has the loss of biodiversity caused climate change? Climate change is caused by the presence or absence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And several things can do that. That's as far as I go.
All right, that's great. I'll bring us back down to earth a little bit. I have a question here that I really like about how the floral industry in particular contributes to aesthetics, to landscaping trends, to sort of shaping what we all like and what we do. Some floral designers use invasive species. On the other hand, you've got more folks trying to incorporate native plants. And so the question is, what role can you imagine designers and growers playing in promoting native ecosystems and this movement? And I might even expand that to ask, are there surprising positions or roles in society or careers that might be able to contribute to Homegrown National Park, whether it's design or, I know you've talked in other iterations of this talk, you've talked about the importance of nursery growers in shaping this movement. So kind of who can we look to be part of that groundswell? Designers and
Okay,
others.
there's another 3 or 4 questions in there at once.
I've got a lot to get through. I'm trying to combine.
Yeah. One of the issues is there room for any compromise? Can you use a non-native plant in a floral design? Yes, you can. Of course you can. There's one study that's been done looking at how many natives it takes to maintain a chickadee food web. And the answer is 70% of the biomass, the plant biomass, has to be native for that to happen. That's one study in one place using one bird. That has been extrapolated across the country to say, well, we need at least 70% native. That's a guess at this point. And it depends on whether you're using keystone species or not. The point is, there is room for compromise. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your non-native florals, you can have your crepe myrtles, as long as they're not invasive. We have to draw the line in invasives because they don't stay where you put them, and they become, serious issues. But sure, we can compromise. We can have beautiful landscapes. You can have that accent plant. We just want to have productivity. Put a couple big oak trees in your yard, and you've got a lot of very productive biomass. You can have your hostas, except the deer say you cannot. So, roles in Homegrown National Park, I don't know.
Sure. I guess the smaller question in there that I maybe tried to make too complicated was, do you see floral design, aesthetics, playing a role in this movement? Do you see native plants as part of design, the wedding industry, the sort of the bigger, becoming less niche in floral horticulture?
Sure, we got a lot of beautiful native plants, and they can become part of the our aesthetic values. They haven't been emphasized in the past because I guess we haven't felt we needed to. We got plenty of beautiful non-natives from all over the world. So do we need, some goldenrod in there? I'm not sure, but can we get it in there? Absolutely.
I think we need goldenrod in there.
Okay, good.
I know that I think every table out there that has flowers on it has at least some goldenrod in their floral arrangements.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe they have answers to that question.
By the way, goldenrod is the top keystone plant, herbaceous plant, perennial, in terms of supporting caterpillars and specialist bees. It supports 110 species of caterpillars and around here about 14 species of native bees that only use the pollen of goldenrod. Very powerful herbaceous plant.
Great. I love goldenrod. All right, I've got a couple of questions that just came in on a similar theme, maybe a little bit simpler.
I
I'll
hope.
try not to pack in 4 this time. The first one is, how do we approach hesitant landowners who love their grass? And the second, similar question, how do we talk to our neighbors who don't understand or maybe care about restoration or conservation? How do we manage people, as your student so astutely pointed out we need
Yeah,
to
well,
do?
that, of course, is the major, major challenge. You know, how does Homegrown National Park reach the non-choir, the people who don't know and don't care about this? It's a sociological issue. I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and I'll tell you what doesn't work. Knocking on their door and tell them they're not living like you and they should change. That's not going to work. What does work, peer pressure has been shown through research to be the most powerful source of behavioral change. You want your neighbors to like you. You want to fit in. So one thing you can do is provide a wonderful model. Reduce your lawn, have a gorgeous landscape, and people walk by and say, hey, maybe I can actually do that too. If maybe a little sign, Homegrown National Park sign, we'll explain why you're doing this and explain that there are really good reasons and help that person who simply is unaware move toward that. I tell a story in Nature's Best Hope of a friend of mine's father. He was that guy. Perfect lawn, keep up with the Joneses. I don't want, everything's got to be immaculate. His daughter she was involved in Monarch Watch, and she was going to these Monarch events all the time, and she kept asking her father to babysit for him when she went away. And finally, he said, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm trying to save the monarch. He said, well, how do you do that? Well, he said, you got to plant milkweed. So he thought about it. He said, well, maybe we can put a few milkweeds against my back fence. So she said, wow. So she put some milkweeds against his back fence, and then he started watching them. The monarchs did come. They laid eggs. And he called her up and said, we need more milkweeds. So in just one experience with monarchs, he switched entirely. He reduced his lawn, and he put it all in because, I don't know, he caught the fever. He got to see a living thing using what he created. And that was an interesting story because he was as hardcore as they came. So.
I love that story. I have another couple similar questions which maybe get into the how do we talk to our neighbors. Something that comes up a lot for these question askers is ticks. So
Yeah.
ticks, they're not in my mowed lawn, but maybe they're in tall grasses or tall native plants. Do they thrive in native plantings? And if so, how do we get around that?
Yeah, ticks have nothing to do with natives. They'll get in tall non-natives too. Yes, they're not in mowed lawn because they want to crawl up on vegetation and quest. They put out their little eggs and they want to grab on you when you walk by. The only ticks that we really need to worry about are the deer ticks, which of course are the ones transmitting Lyme disease. And the real cause of that is too many deer. It's not too many ticks. The ticks will go away if we get rid of the deer, or at least reduce their populations. But what do you do in the meantime? The lawn you keep needs to be manicured. So you're going to have swaths of lawn, and that's where you walk, particularly in May and June, the highest peaks of infectivity. But you can have a well-planted yard every place else. It's just you don't go lay down in there in May because then you're going to get ticks. You can compromise, but it's all about keeping the lawn you have short, but having less of it. You don't need 3 acres of lawn to manage the ticks.
Great. And I guess the second tick question was actually, I think I missed this part at first, it was actually about treating for ticks. Apparently this is being pushed by lawn management companies now, assuming that has the same effects as Mosquito Joe on the larger insect population.
Yeah, of course there's a lot of fear associated with ticks, so companies are going to take advantage of that. Well, I'm going to get rid of your ticks and I'll spray these barrier sprays, which kills everything, by the way, that it comes in contact with. There are products that work better for ticks. I don't know what the current name is. It used to be called Daminex. It's essentially a cotton tube or a cardboard tube that's stuffed with cotton that has been impregnated with pyrethroids. And the white-footed mouse takes those cotton balls and builds their nest out of it, and it kills the ticks on their body. Doesn't hurt the mice, and it seems to be pretty effective, very, very cheap and cost-effective. There's another product, it's like mouse hotels or something where they go in and live there. really expensive, and they manage it yourself, hundreds of dollars a month. So I would try the Daminex first. But spraying your entire property and the trees and everything else to control ticks, it's way, way overboard. I wouldn't do it.
So maybe I'll move from ticks to other problem insects. I have a couple questions in here about spotted lanternfly and a couple about spongy moths. So you can
Okay.
take those together or separately. How do we manage them? How much should we worry about them?
Let's talk about spotted lanternfly first. Another invasive species we brought in. We brought it in, they were egg masses on ornamental rocks from China. And we need to get ornamental rocks from China because there are no ornamental rocks in North America. So the egg masses were on these rocks, and we didn't know it, and they hatched, and they had spotted lanternfly. And initially, it exploded. And this was very near where we live. That was ground zero. But what's happened is this donut effect. So you get this explosion of the populations for a couple of years, very high, and it looks like it's a disaster. By the way, when they feed on Ailanthus, an invasive species, they taste bad. They're very brightly colored. That's aposematic coloration, warning the predators that they taste bad. But when they feed on maple or grapes or apples or something, they don't taste bad. And if you have no Ailanthus around, the birds are learning, hey, these things taste good. And they're actually eating them. I'm finding wings here and there. But what's happening is the population explodes, and then there's this front where the population is very high, but the center collapses. So at my house now, I found 2 this entire year. Last year, maybe I found 5. The year before that, there were probably 5,000. So the populations are collapsing where they've been around several years. So if you're on the front, it looks pretty bad. And if you're an apple grower or a grape grower, that's an issue. But there are no records of spotted lanternfly actually ever killing a tree. And it seems like it's going to control itself over time. So spotted lanternfly, I wouldn't worry about it. Spongy moth, alias gypsy moth, has been here for more than 100 years. Terrible problem. It's essentially an oak specialist, but when it runs out of oaks, it eats everything. And when you have a series of dry springs, that in coordination with the cycle, the population cycle, can cause outbreaks. And you get these huge outbreaks and defoliation, and yes, it kills oaks when they're defoliated a couple years in a row. Do I spray or don't I spray? Do you want to lose your 300-year oak? These are all the issues that come out of it. There is a fungus that made its way here. All of our efforts at biocontrol, nobody brought in the fungus, which actually does control it when you have a cool, wet spring. When you have a cool, wet spring, the fungus breaks out and it kills all the gypsy moth. And then the population's low for several years. Then eventually, it comes up again. Sometimes it's more than 20 years before you see it again. You just had in New England pretty bad gypsy moth years. I think it's damped down now. You're probably going to be okay for several years. But huge problem that we brought it over to begin with. And I don't know what else to tell you.
We've got some pretty serious oak mortality in Columbia County right now from our
Yeah.
spongy moth infestation, so I know that's on a lot of folks' minds, and
Yep.
it's a tough one.
Yep. Well, one
yeah.
thing I hear arborists say, well, don't plant any oaks because they're going to get a disease or the gypsy moth will kill them. Plant more oaks than ever. We can't afford to lose the oaks. There is resistance to all the oak diseases that are out there. We need to find it and favor those trees. And just because the spongy moth might kill it in 30 years, in the meantime, you've got a really productive tree. So don't shy away from oaks, please.
So I have some questions. I have a lot more questions about invasive plants, and I've just gotten the 2-question warning. So maybe I'll just ask you, what would you say to folks who are interested in removing invasive plants to do it and not go crazy? And I'll add from this question, how much should we focus on removing invasive plants alone when it's so difficult for native plants to reestablish on a landscape that's deer stressed, that's defaunated?
Right.
Yeah.
Really good question. When I implied that my wife got rid of our invasives on our 10 acres, that's what happened. She didn't do it overnight. She picked at it. She loved being outside, whacking away at those things. And you'd be surprised. If you have 10 acres of multiflora rose and you kill 2 roses a day, believe it or not, you work your way across and then they're gone. The real question is, how do you get the natives back without the deer eating everything? We had to do it by caging them. We have went to Home Depot and got the galvanized wire cages 5 feet tall. I like to make pretty broad cages, circle around. You know, I made a bunch of cages in it was probably 2002, 2003. I'm still using those cages. You put them around something. When it gets tall enough that the deer can't kill it, I remove it. I call that graduation. I stake them down with rebar, but you can use them over and over again, and you move them around, and you can get plants back in the landscape. So that's when you're acting without waiting to control the deer, but we've got to control our deer so that nature can take its course again.
Great. How do we control the deer? Ooh, that's the cliffhanger. So I want to ask one more question, but I'll let you go on to that one because I think a lot of people are probably having that.
Oh, we know how to control deer. It's a sociological problem. Again, we don't want to. It's the Bambi effect. They are cute. We get that. But you know, when you have deer 10, 12 times over the carrying capacity, they're destroying our forests. They're not allowing any regeneration. They're destroying all the forests, the ground nesting birds. And they're preventing the regeneration of the native systems that we keep talking about. So you can fence them out, very expensive. You can hire sharpshooters for your neighborhood. And they often get about half of the deer, which isn't enough. Because if you have 100 deer and you should have 10, getting half doesn't get them where they need to go. Bern Blasi at Cornell keeps talking about bringing back market hunting. Market hunting works. I mean, look at how well it got rid of those pesky bison. Passenger pigeon, not a problem anymore. So it works, but we got to change a lot of rules. And you know who's against market hunting the most is hunters, because they don't want you to get rid of the deer that they go hunting. But they're not hunting in the suburbs. It's a really complicated problem. But it's a people problem, not a how do we manage deer. We know how to manage deer. Remember, in Pennsylvania, deer were extinct at the turn of the century because we had shot them all. So.
Wicked problem, to be sure.
A wicked problem, yes.
And I'll add that part of the reason I'm so appreciative of Columbia Land Conservancy is that they are really attending to this wicked problem of managing deer. And I think if there's still space, there's a hunter course coming up this fall for new hunters who are coming to it from an ecological mindset. So if anybody's interested in taking matters into their own hands on their own landscapes, Columbia Land Conservancy has you covered within this county. So we have time for one more. So the last question I think I'll ask, and actually I want to, of course, give Doug the last word, so I just want to thank everyone again for being here, and also to say I haven't been able to get to all questions. There are some great ones if you still have questions. If we have time, I really encourage checking out the folks at the tables, including our wonderful sponsors who have tons and tons of plant knowledge and might be able to shed light on some of these issues. And if not tonight, then another night. We've got time. So last question I'll ask is how would you recommend that folks get involved in monitoring biodiversity's return to their yards after they have successfully established native plants? You mentioned however many thousand species of moths and birds. If somebody's coming to it for the first time, what should they be looking out for? Any tools that might help to see it happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, if you've got a favorite group, maybe you love bats. Actually, you can get recorders that you walk out at night, and it will record bat beeps and tell you what species they are. That's something that's out there. There are also acoustic recorders that you can turn them on for as long as you want, but it will record all the sounds in your yard, all the bird sounds, all the frog sounds, all the katydid sounds, all the grillotalpid sounds, and you can essentially measure biodiversity that way without actually being out there to do it. Then you have to play it back and listen to it. There are AI apps, whatever you call them, that will identify those sounds for you and say, well, this is this. I mean, you know, what's the bird? Merlin. You know, it hears the bird sound and tell you what the birds are. And that's another one. You have that right on your phone. You can look at the birds that are at least in your yard making noises in your yard. A lot of people say, well, I'm just going to count the insects in my yard. That's pretty hard, actually, because unless, I don't know, how you sample those insects is really important. When you sample them, where you sample them, and most people can't identify them when they sample them. You can, you could pick a group that's a little more manageable, like butterflies. How many butterflies do I see? Make sure you're not counting the same one over and over again. I don't know. You have to pick the group you want to spend the most time with, and you need a baseline. What did it start with, and what do you end up with? But just walking out there, you get a feeling. Is there more life around me now than there used to be? I guarantee there will be. Bees, you can do bees, but bee identification is tough too. So.
Great. I think that's a perfect way to end because you said pick the group that you want to spend the most time with, and that's this group for me. So thank you, Doug.
So staff tell me that I'm competitive at times. So what I want to see happen is with the Homegrown National Park, that Columbia County lights up on their map and really stands out, and that we're better than Dutchess and Rensselaer and Albany as part of that with the number of folks we see on there. So please go home as part of this and sign up on your Homegrown National Park and be an active participant in that. I want to come back and hear from you all in regards to what you've done, what promises you've made to yourselves tonight as part of this, that you're going to take action on this. I want to thank you for attending, the CLC staff that really made this happen. New Leaf Eco Landscapes as a sponsor, Arthur Points as a sponsor, but especially Doug. We want to thank you one more time for making the trip. Thank you.